On May 19, 1998, tragedy strikes Lincoln County High School. The small town is shocked as a national wave of schoolyard shootings comes violently home. And a local prosecutor fights for reason and justice in the midst of controversy.
Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Make sure to like and subscribe.
In the small town of Fayetteville, Tennessee, a high school honor student is tried for murder. The defense mounts a convincing case for leniency.
He's not guilty of first-degree murder.
But the prosecutor, as the chief law enforcement officer of the community that elected him, calls for punishment.
A school, to my way of thinking, deserves the same sanctity as a church. It's where a young person goes to learn. And if they can't feel safe there, where in God's world are they going to feel safe? And when one of these things happens, the justice has to be swift. A message has to go out there. We're not going to have kids carrying guns to school to kill kids.
May 19th, 1998. It was 3 days before graduation at Lincoln County High School in Fayetteville, Tennessee. There were proms, parties, and other celebrations. Seniors were looking forward to life after high school. Unfortunately, that day, the festive mood was marred by tragedy. Shortly after 2 p.m., Fayetteville Police Dispatch received a 911 call from the school secretary. She reported that a student had been shot in the school parking lot, and the shooter was still at the scene.
We've had a shooting at the high school, and they get on over pretty quick.
Fayetteville Police Investigator Bill Wood was the first to respond to the scene. In this episode, the names of some of the witnesses have been changed to protect their identity. When he arrived, Detective Wood saw a young man lying on the ground. A teacher said the victim's name was Nick Creason. He had been shot several times. He appeared to be unconscious. Another teacher told Wood the student who fired the shots, Jacob Davis, was sitting on the ground nearby. A faculty member had retrieved the weapon.
Jacob Davis, how old are you?
Investigator Wood placed Davis under arrest.
Jacob, just to me, showed no emotion. When I had my hand on him, there was no trembling, there was no crying. You know, he wasn't upset at all. I said, "How old are you?" He said, "I'm 18. I advised him of his rights. I said, "Do you want to make a statement to me?" And he said, "I just need an attorney."
At 18, Jacob Davis was barely an adult in the eyes of the law. If his victim died, he would be charged with the most serious of crimes. Had the shooting occurred just a few months earlier, he would have been charged as a juvenile. Paramedics determined that Creason was alive, but he had sustained multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. His condition was critical. Emergency room staff rushed to save the life of the young man. but he suffered from massive internal damage. One lung was punctured, a major artery was severed, and when his pulse began to drop, they could do little to sustain his life for more than a few moments. In the high school parking lot, Investigator Wood secured the crime scene and began processing evidence. Police recovered the weapon used in the shooting, a .22 caliber Marlin rifle. They also found 3 bullet casings near the victim's body.
Come take a look at this.
Investigators examined a car that witnesses said belonged to Jacob Davis, the alleged shooter. The vehicle contained valuable evidence that would later be used by prosecutors. They recovered a box of CCI .22 Magnum shells and a handwritten note. Later, Detective Wood went to the hospital to check on the victim's condition.
Where's the morgue?
When I arrived, of course, I found out that the victim was deceased. He had been shot multiple times.
With Nick Creason dead, Investigator Wood collected the victim's clothing and personal items and entered them into evidence.
Thank you.
The autopsy was performed by medical examiner Dr. Charles Harlan.
Each of the 3 gunshot wounds in this case that caused the death of Nick Creason is in and of itself a fatal wound. The most devastating wound is the wound which goes through the heart, the right lung, the pulmonary artery, and the aorta. This is a type of wound which does not allow itself to be readily surgically repaired.
Jacob Davis was charged with first-degree murder, carrying a weapon on school property, and reckless endangerment with a weapon. He still refused to make a statement. Detective Wood interviewed several witnesses, including over a dozen students who helped him piece together what had happened that tragic afternoon.
I want to go over some of the details as to what happened to talk about today.
One of the student witnesses was Susie Wilkins, a friend of Nick Creason's. She was in the unfortunate position of having seen the whole incident in grisly detail. She explained that she was walking with Nick, heading toward his truck. Then she and Nick were confronted by Jacob Davis, who was wielding a rifle. Susie said 3 shots were fired. After the first shot, Nick held up his books in a futile attempt to deflect the next bullet.
I didn't know where it came from. And
Shop teacher Ricky Bryant was also on the scene.
I went running out the door and then heard another gunshot.
Somebody call 911, Nick.
As a student rushed to the side of the victim, Bryant picked up the rifle to keep Jacob Davis from shooting anyone else. Eyewitnesses said Jacob Davis never uttered a word during the incident. When he was finished shooting, he sat and waited for the police. After the murder, investigators found several clues in Jacob Davis's car, including a letter he had written. The note was addressed to friends, family, Carol, all. In the first paragraph of the letter, Jacob wrote, "I don't know what will happen to me this evening. I guess this will be goodbye should something happen to myself and I am not able to speak to those dearest to me. He went on to express his love for his family and friends, but he reserved a special part of the letter for someone named Carol. Detective Wood located Carol Taylor, a senior at Lincoln County High School, and he would soon learn that the young woman was at the center of the tragedy. In the aftermath of the fatal shooting of Lincoln County High School senior Nicholas Creason by fellow student Jacob Davis, Fayetteville police investigator Bill Wood was faced with the task of piecing together the events that led up to the tragedy. Detective Wood found a letter in Jacob's car. Much of the letter was directed to another student named Carol Taylor.
Why would he not get much sleep?
In his interview with Carol, Wood learned that she and Jacob had been dating for about 6 months. They met at a restaurant where they both worked. Jacob became so enamored with Carol that he turned down a scholarship from Mississippi State University, choosing instead to join Carol at the local community college. Carol told Detective Wood that before she dated Jacob, she dated the victim, Nick Creason.
Yeah, we've been dating for a while.
She explained that while she was dating Jacob, she secretly spent Valentine's Day with Nick and had sex. Eventually, Jacob found out.
Within the hour,
According to Carol, there was visible tension between the young men in the months leading up to the murder.
Do you understand me? You understand me? Great.
Though the two never came to blows, there were several confrontations both on and off school grounds. She also told Detective Wood about an incident that had occurred on the night before the murder.
Well, I'm hoping I'm not pregnant.
While she and Jacob
Well,
were
if you are,
shopping for a
that'd be
home
great.
pregnancy test,
No,
Carol made a confession.
Last time.
It was a couple of months ago.
She told him that she had shopped for a pregnancy test a few months earlier when she thought she may have been pregnant with Nick Creason's child.
Something happened.
According to Carol, Jacob Davis had an extremely emotional, angry reaction.
It's no big deal. I
The
wasn't
confession
pregnant.
confirmed that her affair with Nick was more serious than she had led him to believe. Jacob collected himself, and he and Carol were intimate again later that night.
You knew both these things.
According to Carol, on the morning of the murder, Susie Wilkins tossed a penny that hit Carol.
Hey man, are you trying to start something with me?
The incident resulted in a stare-down between Jacob and Nick, but the young men were able to leave it there for the moment. Then, later in the day, Jacob
what do you think
confronted
you're doing,
Nick
man?
as he and Carol were heading
What are
into
you
their
doing
math
with my
class.
girlfriend?
We're just going into class, okay? It's not a big
Sensing things could turn violent,
What do you mean it's not
Carol
a big deal?
intervened.
deal. You and me, right? Oh. 4 or 5 months.
Based on information he received from Carol Taylor and several other witnesses, investigator Wood put together the rest of the tragedy's timeline.
Jacob, who lived 12 miles from the school in the Syerston community, had left the school, gone home, gotten the rifle and the ammunition, and returned to the school. Before arriving, he stopped on the side of the road and wrote the letter that we found in the car.
Then at 2 p.m., Jacob Davis returned to the school. Within the hour, Nick Creason would be dead. 3 days after the murder at the Lincoln County Courthouse, Davis was arraigned for his crimes, including first-degree murder. An hour later, down the block at Higgins Funeral Home, a service was held for Nicholas Creason. He was buried in Boonville Cemetery. And still later that same day, the grief-stricken Lincoln County High School class of 1998 graduated. They were minus 2 students, one dead, the other in jail for murder. A student wearing Nick Creason's football jersey accepted his diploma for him. Prosecuting Jacob Davis was Lincoln County District Attorney General Mike McCown.
This was a highly emotional thing. It involved my hometown. Certainly, I know a lot of people at school who were very emotionally tied up in this. And I listened to a lot of them, listened to their feelings on what they thought happened and what they thought should be done.
The day of the murder, criminal defense attorney Ray Fraley received a call from Jacob Davis's father.
And his son was being held in jail, and he asked me to go down and see him. And I told him at that point that I just didn't know that I could get involved with a local case. I've tried 6 or 7 first-degree murder cases and several homicide cases, but this was just too close. I mean, the principal of the high school was a close friend of mine. Nick Creason was a football player, and his coach, Lewis Thompson, was a close friend of mine, and I just didn't know if I could get myself involved in that type of a case. Hello. Hi, Lawrence. Did you talk to me?
After a second call from Jacob's father, Ray Fraley agreed to take the case.
Get up, you have a visitor.
I knew immediately by talking to him that he needed help. I got him out of the cell, sat him down in the library of the jail, and we talked for an hour or so. I couldn't get a lot out of him because he was in a complete stupor. I mean, he was in shock. I just wanted to really sit there and comfort him more than anything and let him know that he had somebody that was going to be with him side by side through this tragedy and the procedures that go with these kind of cases.
I didn't commit any.
As Jacob Davis's attorney, Ray Fraley's first priority was to prevent the state from seeking the death penalty against his client.
I met with the DA, a friend of mine, Mike McCown. And of course, he was under a great deal of pressure from the community and the nation at large, I guess, because of the way these things were happening.
In order to seek the death penalty in Tennessee, one of 13 criteria must be met. The criteria include that there be multiple victims, or that the victims be law enforcement officers or judges.
It was my opinion that given all the circumstances, that this was either a life or life without parole situation as opposed to a death penalty situation.
So the defense and prosecution agreed that the death penalty would not be pursued. The prosecution and defense agreed to select a jury from outside the county. Fayetteville, Tennessee is 80 miles south of Nashville, about 30 miles north of Alabama. Fayetteville's population is around 7,500. Everyone in the small town knew about the tragedy at Lincoln County High School. Finding an impartial jury that had not heard of the case would be difficult.
But Mike McCown, the prosecutor, and I both agreed that it would be impossible, virtually impossible, to get a jury in Lincoln County. Everybody centers, our community centers around that high school. And either folks here were directly involved, perhaps with the shooting in that one of their children may have witnessed it, and or teachers were there, and students have teachers. It was just a strange situation for us, and that was on both sides.
Jurors would be bussed in from nearby Dixon County. Dixon County was chosen because it resembles Lincoln County's geographical, social, and economic features. The day before Jacob Davis's trial, the jury was brought to the Lincoln County Courthouse. They would be sequestered until the trial's end. The trial began on July 26, 1999, a year and 2 months after the murder took place.
In this case, I didn't think of Jacob Davis as being a defendant. He was an accused, but he was a young man who needed help. He was a young man who had never experienced anything like this in his life, had nothing in his background to indicate that this would ever happen, and nothing in his background to indicate it would ever happen again. An isolated incident.
Certainly there was more than one victim in this case. And I suppose maybe that Davis, some considered him a victim too, but he chose to take the law in his own hands and execute somebody. And I have a hard time feeling sorry for him.
Ultimately, the jury would have to learn about the circumstances that led up to the murder, Jacob Davis's psychological state, and most importantly, why he murdered his classmate.
All rise. The court of the Honorable Judge Charles Lee is now in session.
Be seated.
The State of Tennessee versus Jacob Davis. Mr. McGowan, your opening statement, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Your Honor.
Prosecutor Mike McCown began his opening
Morning, ladies and
statement
gentlemen
by
of the
telling
jury.
the jury that they would see that the murder of Nick
This is a sad
Creason
case.
was premeditated.
In order to convict someone of first-degree murder in Tennessee, you must prove that it was an unlawful, intentional, premeditated crime. On the 19th day of May, 1998, there were several things that happened that indicated that Davis was thinking about doing harm to Creason.
Took place.
Mike
The evidence
McCown
would
also
show
argued
this
that
man,
Davis was of sound
Jacob
mind at the
Davis,
time of the shooting.
with premeditated murder and forethought, shot to
For
death
the prosecution,
a young man,
the
Nicholas
murder
Creason.
was a classic case of
But
lovers'
it's an easy
jealousy
choice.
that
We'll take you through the
exploded into
evidence,
violence.
and it will lead you to one conclusion, that Jacob Davis is guilty. Thank you.
You have an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
In his opening statement, Ray Fraley argued that Jacob Davis suffered from diminished mental capacity.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What we have is
Fraley
a
contended
teenage
that his
tragedy.
client was severely depressed,
Jacob
sleep
Davis.
deprived for a period of months leading up to the murder, and that he heard voices.
Didn't have full mental capacity of killing Nick
The
Creason.
diminished capacity defense should not be confused with the better-known insanity defense.
First-degree murder.
Well, insanity, if you are shown to be insane, then that's a complete defense. You can be exonerated, found not guilty by insanity. But to suffer a diminished capacity, that's not really a defense in a sense that you can completely avoid culpability. It just means that the jury can consider whether or not there was a requisite intent to form premeditation for a first-degree
What
murder.
we have is a teenage tragedy.
For the defense,
Jacob
the
Davis,
tragedy could not be dismissed as a case of
sleep-deprived,
lovers' jealousy. It was about a young man
didn't
who
have full
became
mental
mentally
capacity of
unbalanced
killing Nick
and
Creason.
eventually snapped.
But we submit that he's not guilty.
Fraley argued that his
of
client should be
first-degree murder.
convicted of a lesser crime than first-degree murder, such as second-degree murder or involuntary manslaughter.
Prosecution, you may call your next witness.
Several students testified at the trial. The most anticipated testimony came from the young lady who found herself in the center of this tragedy, Carol Taylor.
Swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do.
The prosecution questioned Carol about her relationship with both the
Can you
defendant
tell us
and the
about
victim.
how long you dated?
Carol told the jury how Jacob Davis learned of the
About
Valentine's
4 or 5
Day
months.
tryst she
4 or 5
had
months,
with
but
Nick
you've known him for
Creason.
quite some time, is that correct?
Yes.
Word of the affair got out 2 months before the murder in Mrs. Roberts' fourth period physics class.
stuff like that. But I mean, it's okay if you talk to him.
I don't even know what she was thinking. They were like almost fighting.
A friend of Jacob's overheard students discussing the affair with the teacher. It wasn't long before Jacob learned of Carol's infidelity.
What?
Yo, it's Nick, man.
Are you kidding me?
No.
The news devastated him.
Stop messing with me, man.
I'm not lying.
On the afternoon Jacob found out about the affair, he and Carol had a heated discussion in the school's parking lot.
Just listen what I have to say. Come on!
He took a gun
The
to
argument ended 4 hours later
pulled it out
when
of his
Jacob
trunk and
handed
shot
Carol a letter. It was the first of 3 letters written by the defendant that the jury would hear read aloud during the trial.
Lincoln County High School.
How long have you
The
done
prosecution hoped the letter would help convince the jury that the murder of Nick Creason was premeditated. It was
like you to read
written
this
2
letter out
months
loud.
before the shooting.
record?
Read it all.
Just read it all and try to speak up.
I don't deserve this, Carol. From the beginning, I have given you nothing but my all. And for what? To be with you. That is all I have asked. I'm faithful. I'm true. I'm honest. My heart screams, how could you? And you talk about your night at work. I bleed, and for that he should bleed as well. My friends say I should take this anger out on you. You know as well as I do I can't do that. It must go somewhere, thus this letter.
Jacob Davis went on to further
did
declare
you feel
both
when you
his
read the
love
letter?
for Carol and disappointment in her.
I was a little worried.
For prosecutor Mike McCown, Jacob's violent words against Nick Creason were strong evidence that the crime was premeditated.
Now, this was approximately 60 days before the murder, so that told us that he was evidently entertaining these violent thoughts for a long period of time before he actually committed the murder.
Yes.
But the same piece of
What was his
evidence
reaction?
could be interpreted 2
He
ways,
was okay.
and the defense had its own interpretation
About
of the letter.
7 or 8, I guess.
I used it to show that this was a pattern of deterioration, which supported my position that he had suffered and was suffering a diminished capacity to form the requisite intent.
During any of the visits that you went to see the defendant,
The prosecution believed the defendant was in
Did you
control
ever
of
ask him
himself
why
when
he
he shot the victim. They hoped that Carol Taylor's testimony would support their argument.
Did you see any great change in him at all during the months of April or May of that year?
He seemed happier.
Happier?
Yeah, happier.
Carol
for what
testified
purposes
that in the months leading up to the murder,
did you go to Walmart?
Jacob's anger actually seemed to
the
subside.
She
She testified about the incident at the drugstore. She claimed that Jacob recovered quickly after hearing the news that she had shopped for a pregnancy test once before with Nick Creason.
Something happened.
He gave you the letter.
The prosecution later questioned Carol about the numerous times she visited Jacob in jail after he committed the murder.
Yes.
The prosecution hoped her testimony about the visits would demonstrate that Jacob was of sound mind shortly after the murder,
Jacob?
that he knew what he had done,
Hey.
and he had no regrets.
Okay. You okay?
About how many times did you see him?
About, I don't remember, about 7 or 8, I guess.
And during any of these visits that you went to see the defendant, Jacob Davis, did you ever ask him why he shot Nick Creason?
Yes.
What did he say?
He said, you know why, but I can't tell you. I can't say.
In his cross-examination, defense attorney Ray Fraley attempted to get Carol Taylor to
State
paint
your
a
name
very
again.
different picture of Jacob Davis.
Carol Taylor.
The defense asked Carol about the night before the murder, when she and Jacob shopped for a pregnancy test.
First, when you got to the store, you mentioned to Jacob that you had been there before for one of these tests. And you had been with Nick Creason sometime before?
Yes.
What you didn't tell the jury, I don't think you left it out on purpose. You weren't asked. Jacob Davis collapsed on the floor.
Yes.
And cried
Yes.
uncontrollably.
Yes.
Why would you bring up his name?
Ray Fraley used Carol Taylor's testimony to support his contention that Jacob was suffering from sleep deprivation prior to the murder.
During this period of time after this march, there is no question in your mind, is there, that he was absolutely sleep deprived?
No.
You could see it. He was getting haggard, wasn't he?
Yes.
You were concerned about his health.
Yes.
So this young man, on the night of the pregnancy test, and the episode that you have described at your house, went home, and you met him the next morning at 7 or so.
Yes.
Again, he hadn't had any sleep, had he?
No.
At Shoney's and with you, he seemed to be all right.
Yes.
Sort of a security, wasn't it?
Yes.
Then we went to the first exam, which is physics.
Yes.
Did you have that class with him?
Yes.
He didn't even take the exam, did he?
No.
The same young man who on the night before was out of control, crying, shaking, begging you, wrote a letter.
Yes.
All of these things were happening in his life. Uncontrollable bouts of crying and shaking at various times, including the times that were not mentioned in the car with him, where he would just lose it. All of these times were times that Mr. McCowan expressed to you were times of utter happiness for Jacob Davis.
Yes.
That wasn't so, was he?
No.
Did he seem fine?
He seemed fine. When he left, he was fine. Said he was okay.
Do you recognize
Lincoln
this letter?
County High School teacher Tiffany
If you would,
Roberts took
please
the
read
stand.
the contents of that letter.
She taught the victim in a separate class. News of the affair between Carol and Nick first leaked out in one of Mrs. Roberts' classes. Roberts testified that on the morning of the murder, Jacob Davis took his final physics exam. After he handed in his test, he wrote a 2-page letter and gave it to her. She read the letter later in the day. It began by expressing Jacob's dissatisfaction with the education system.
Knowledge leads me to question the word bestow. The education system in this country, this state, verified this country is quite simply a farce. For the past 12 years, I have simply been bored.
Jacob went on to accuse Mrs. Roberts of participating in gossip surrounding Carol and Nick Creason.
But you dealt me a very devastating personal insult earlier this year by discussing my personal life with that Nicholas Creason. You were a large part of the greatest pain I have ever known, a pain which nearly caused me to take my own life.
Mrs. Roberts testified that after reading the letter, she rushed the note to the school's principal, Jim Stewart. He tried to track down Jacob, but couldn't find him. Jacob had already gone home to pick up the rifle. The jury would hear a third and final letter written by the defendant. Investigator Bill Wood took the stand.
Yes, I did. This letter was found in Mr. Davis's car.
Much of the letter was written to Carol and detailed Jacob's anger toward Nick.
All I ever wanted was to love and be loved by you. I gave you everything, and it is so sad that you could not return my devotion. So now I cut myself from that. I lust to kill him.
The prosecution and the defense both used Jacob's letters to support their arguments.
The letters were varied, but in my opinion, they showed the deterioration of Jacob's mental state, which gave rise to the argument of diminished capacity. The state, on the other hand, used these letters to show an absolute jealous rage on the part of Jacob Davis. So it was a double-edged sword, without question.
The defense argued that Jacob's deteriorating mental state led to the shooting,
Prior to the killing, is that not correct?
but the prosecution claimed that the murder was motivated by lovers' jealousy.
Well, he's always been a bit sensitive.
Now, expert witnesses from both sides would take the stand. Jacob's fate would depend on who the jury believed. Although there was plenty of emotional testimony at Jacob Davis's trial, the centerpiece of his defense's argument was a very scientific one. That he was suffering from a diminished mental capacity and was unable to form the intent necessary for first-degree murder. Key to proving the defense's argument was child psychologist Dr. William Kenner of Nashville. Dr. Kenner interviewed Jacob Davis a year before the trial.
I do.
Dr. Kenner is a noted psychologist, and particularly in fields of diminished capacity. And he agreed with me that there was something in this child's past that appeared after everything was taken into consideration, the totality of all the circumstances of this young man's life, that in fact he was, at the time of this tragedy, suffering from a diminished capacity.
At trial, all of these folks testified, and their experts testified that he did suffer from diminished capacity, and the states testified that he didn't. And it got down to a question of fact for the jury, and they made their call based on what they heard from the psychiatric testimony.
Doctor.
Several months before the trial, Dr. Kenner met with Jacob Davis in prison. The defense asked Dr. Kenner for his diagnosis.
Psychotic features.
According to Dr. Kenner, Jacob suffered from severe major depression and what he termed were psychotic features, such as hearing voices.
Have you tried to sleep?
A major depression with psychotic features will often have voices, as Jacob described. In his case, as in many other cases, the voices were not ones that were command hallucinations where God or someone important was telling him to do something. Rather, it was like a Greek chorus in the background that was mumbling about how worthless he was, so that when he became more upset, when things were more difficult for him, the voices simply got louder.
The defense's claim that Jacob Davis was hearing voices caught the prosecution by surprise.
That's the first we ever heard of any voices. It was not in any of the reports. It didn't come back in any other form whatsoever until the psychiatrist got on the witness stand and testified about the voices.
On antidepressants.
Dr. Kenner testified that both sides of Jacob Davis's family had a history of severe depression.
Jacob's family has a history
An
of
aunt
depression.
had even committed suicide.
I understand that.
In this history,
Freely asked the doctor if the emotions that had been aroused in Davis were so significant that they removed him from reality.
on the date of this tragedy.
The doctor testified that the emotions were very intense, and his ability to control those emotions was significantly diminished because of his psychosis.
Mr. Bernard, you want to start your questioning?
The prosecution attempted to counter the defense's diminished mental capacity argument with a rebuttal witness, psychiatrist Dr. Rokia Farouk of the Tennessee Mental Health Institute.
Did you form an opinion?
Our opinion at that time of the incident was he was not suffering from any kind of mental disease or defect that is going to make him incapable of forming intent.
Intent to commit the crime was possible, Dr. Farouk testified, because although Jacob Davis was depressed, the level of depression was not so severe that it rendered him incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong.
The state's experts actually agreed with much of what I was saying. Where they disagreed was in terms of how severely depressed he was, because they evaluated him a year and a half, I believe, after the crime.
Dr. Farouk,
the defense pointed out that the state psychiatrists based their testimony on evaluations they made over a year after the crime, and after Jacob had received treatment for depression from prison psychiatrists. As for the argument that Jacob may have been hearing voices, Dr. Farouk testified that hearing of voices can be normal in certain situations.
You don't give it much importance that the young man was hearing voices. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
You all disagree about that, right?
Yes.
They didn't deny, they being the experts for the state, didn't deny that Jacob was undergoing some emotional trauma. But they didn't think it arose to the level of diminished capacity.
Well, tell me this, Dr. Farouk.
Defense attorney McGee wrapped up the cross-examination by challenging Dr. Farouk's testimony that Jacob Davis's depression was not severe. He pointed out that Dr. Farouk herself prescribed an antidepressant for Jacob Davis while she evaluated him. Dr. Farouk testified that the antidepressant also worked for mild depression.
Dr. Farouk, you're excused. Thank you. Mr. McCallum, are you ready for your
For all of the psychological arguments the defense made,
Ladies and gentlemen
the
of the
crux
jury,
of the
over the past
prosecution's
days,
argument was based on physical evidence and eyewitness accounts
Exposed to a lot of information, a lot of testimony. I realize that's a lot
that
to
Jacob
process.
Davis had spent months thinking about the murder.
She took the stand.
The prosecution referred to the many letters that Jacob Davis had written that could be interpreted
well
to
before
show
he killed
premeditation.
the victim, or before he killed the victim.
Even on the day of the murder, the prosecution contended, he had plenty of time to think about his crime and reconsider as he drove the 12 miles each way to and from his house to pick up the rifle he used in the killing. The prosecution had evidence that he lay in wait for 20 minutes before ambushing Nick Creason. And then there was the act itself. And the time it took to reload. And reload yet again.
Yes, Your Honor.
During closing arguments, defense attorney Ray Fraley told the jury that the murder was a teenage tragedy. And he urged the jury to
Ladies and
convict Jacob
gentlemen
Davis
of the
of a
jury.
lesser crime than first-degree murder.
He's not innocent. He is guilty of killing Nick Creason. But we submit that he is not guilty of first-degree murder.
Shortly after the closing arguments, the jury was given the case and sent to deliberate. The jury could find Davis guilty of voluntary manslaughter, second-degree murder, or first-degree murder. After a week of testimony, the fate of young Jacob Davis was now in the jury's hands. High school honor student Jacob Davis was accused of murdering fellow classmate Nick Creason. His fate was in the hands of the jury, which was deciding whether to convict Davis of voluntary manslaughter, second-degree murder, or first-degree murder.
Yes, we have, Your Honor.
Bill? Will the defendant please stand?
We, the jury, find Jacob Davis guilty of first-degree murder.
It took the jury 4 hours to return a verdict. The prosecutors got what they wanted. The jury found Jacob Davis guilty of first-degree murder. In a minor victory for the defense, the jury allowed for the possibility of parole. Under Tennessee law, the minimum time Jacob Davis will serve before he's eligible will be 51 years, when he will be 70 years old.
The jury, the state of Tennessee thanks you for your contribution in this case. You are excused.
Despite the minor victory, defense attorney Ray Fraley was disappointed in the verdict and the sentence.
It is, if not draconian, just absolutely unbelievable to me that thinking of Jacob Davis as a 18-year-old boy, 55 years in prison. But that's the law as it presently exists.
Prosecutor Mike McCown felt differently.
In the case of Nicholas Creason, eternity is forever. The sentence that Davis imposed on him has no possibility of parole and no possibility of commutation by a governor. He is dead and will be dead eternally.
Jacob Davis is now serving time in a Tennessee prison. When asked what he would say to the victim's parents, he had this to say.
There's no way that I could ever fully realize what they've gone through. But as much as I can, you know, as much as I do understand, you know, I'm sorry. I would give anything to take this back. I would give anything to change this. I never wanted all this to happen. I don't understand how it did happen, but it did, and it's on my hands. And I'd do anything. I'd do anything to take it back.
After Jacob Davis's trial, Mike McCown told the press that he hoped the harsh sentence Jacob Davis received would send a message that society was not going to tolerate guns being taken to school. Although the message may have been sent, sadly, it has not been heard. The tragedy of the Lincoln County High School has since been overshadowed by several other higher-profile school shootings. One occurred just 2 days after Jacob Davis murdered Nick Creason. In Springfield, Oregon, a student named Kip Kinkle shot and killed his parents. He then went to school and shot several students. And on April 20th, 1999, 2 students walked into Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, and opened fire, killing 12 students and 1 teacher in the worst school massacre in U.S. history. Today, Jacob Davis's mother, Phyllis, works at the same restaurant she worked at before the shooting. She is still struggling to understand what went wrong in Jacob's life during his last 2 years at the Fayetteville High School.
I feel totally and absolutely guilty because I was in denial that anything could be wrong with Jacob Davis. We just didn't see what was going on inside, and I think that's a parent's responsibility above everything else, is to know what's going on inside your kids. You don't let the TV raise your kids. You don't turn them over to the computer. You don't turn them over to the school. You know what's going on in their lives. And during those 2 years, we didn't know. We honestly did not know what was going on.
Jacob Davis's crime left many victims in its wake. A community badly shaken, a promising young man dead, and Davis himself in prison for at least 51 years. District Attorney General Mike McCown had won a conviction. But ultimately, there can be no winners in the wake of such an American tragedy. On a summer night in 1998, a policeman is gunned down in Houston, Texas. And a vicious killer goes on the run. Authorities launch a manhunt. And the prosecutors fight for justice in the case of a cold-blooded murderer who claims he is a victim of police brutality concealed by a code of silence. A 25-year-old police officer was brutally shot to death after crossing paths with a suspected gang member in Houston, Texas. To obtain justice, prosecutor Chuck Rosenthal would have to take a tragic journey through the wasted lives of a promising young police officer and a hardened teenage killer.
It was a very ironic situation that both these kids basically came from the same neighborhood as they started out. Both the kids really came from very similar backgrounds. One kid went one way and one went the other.
September 29th, 1998. For Deputy Constables Michael Eakin and Matthew McCord, the night had started out like any other. The two officers had been on patrol in Houston's North End, conducting radar checks for speeding vehicles. The air was hot, still, and thick with humidity, typical for Houston, Texas in late summer. It was a few minutes past midnight when a Cadillac sped by.
You got him. All right, you sure you got this, huh? All right, I got it.
Okay. All right, this is Eakin, dispatch, radio check.
Deputy Eakin pursued the speeding vehicle into a deserted parking lot alongside the Hardy Toll Road, a drab stretch of highway that connects the airport to downtown Houston. As the Cadillac stopped, Eakin reported his location to dispatch.
Tom George, Tom 27 George.
Tom 13.
The deputy got out of his vehicle and approached the car.
What is this? Shoot.
There were 6 teenagers in the Cadillac.
All right.
He asked to see their
I'm gonna
identification.
need to see some IDs, people.
If any of the car's occupants were under 18, they were in violation of the city's 11 p.m. curfew. One young man in the back seat failed to produce an ID.
All right, get out of the car. Get out of the car, sir. Everyone keep your hands
Eakin
right.
had him step out of the car and began to frisk the subject.
Down, sir.
Suddenly, the young man broke away and ran into a nearby field. Deputy Eakin pursued him, and the two disappeared into the darkness.
Tom 13.
Seconds later, the constable's dispatch received a brief, garbled radio transmission from Eakin.
Tom 13.
The dispatcher asked the deputy to clarify, but there was no response.
8100 to 1 Tom 16.
Alarmed, the dispatcher contacted Deputy McCord.
Tom 16, yes sir, I need you to show yourself en route to 13300 East Hardy. I need you to check by with Tom 13.
She gave him the location of the traffic stop, asking him to drive by to see if Eakin needed assistance.
South.
Within minutes, McCord was on the scene. He spotted the patrol car of his friend Michael Eakin. It was empty, parked behind a Cadillac with 5 teenage occupants.
Need you to exit the car on the driver's side only.
Deputy Eakin was nowhere in sight.
Exit the car, driver's side only. Keep your hands where I can see them. Lay face down on the ground. Keep your hands out in front of you. Where is he at? Where is he at?
He went that way, running after Jose.
Running where?
He went that way, running after Jose.
This is McCord. I need back up.
Boy 15, go to civil. 1 David 18, traffic.
Units responded from the Harris County Constable's Office, the Sheriff's Department, and the Houston Police Department.
Okay, keep your hands where we can see them. Keep them just where they are. What do we got?
All right, sir, when I get on the scene, there were these 5 suspects.
McCord briefed the officers, who immediately cordoned off the area and began searching the property.
Right there.
They were hopeful that the missing deputy was still out there, perhaps trying to find the man who had fled from the traffic stop. But Deputy Eakin had not responded on his radio. Something was wrong. In a nearby field, officers saw a figure lying still in the grass. It was Deputy Constable Michael Eakin. He had been fatally shot in the throat.
There's nothing here. What do you got, Joe? I don't have any pulse. No pulse?
The young occupants in the car, out well after Houston's 11 p.m. curfew for minors, were searched for weapons and taken into custody. They, along with the passenger who had fled, were now suspects in a homicide. They were tested for powder burns, a telltale sign of having just fired a weapon.
Okay, turn that hand over.
No powder residue was found.
All right.
I did it.
All right.
Harris County Assistant District Attorney Chuck Rosenthal was called to the scene and arrived shortly before dawn. According to policy at the Harris County District Attorney's Office, a prosecutor is assigned to a case at the very beginning of an investigation whenever a law enforcement officer is wounded or killed.
I guess the thing that struck me immediately upon seeing him was how young he looked. And the bullet wound to his neck was the only one that I saw that I took to be a contact wound.
Hopefully they can get out here.
Near the body, detectives found a clue left by the killer. A small medallion and chain. The image depicted on the medallion was of a man sitting in an electric chair. Inscribed on the back was the name of a gangster rap company. The medallion was covered in blood. Monitoring police communications, television news crews quickly descended on the crime scene. There, they interviewed Chief J.C. Mosier of the Harris County Constable's Office, Precinct 1.
We got a lot of people in the department that are still asleep, don't even know it's happened, and they're going to be coming to work finding out that the first officer in the history of our department has been killed in the line of duty. So that's going to be rough. This is just one of those terrible, tragic things that happens in the life of police officers and police departments, unfortunately.
Multiple law enforcement agencies were called out in force. Not only had an officer been murdered, but an armed fugitive was still on the loose. Teams mobilized to continue processing the crime scene and to find Michael Eakin's killer. But in a city of nearly 2 million people, if the shooter was not found quickly, he could easily blend in or escape the city limits entirely.
You want to get out and check that quantum?
The 5 passengers of the vehicle, now in custody at Harris County's Homicide Division, were questioned by detectives of the Sheriff's Department.
A police officer was killed tonight.
In this episode, the names of some of the witnesses have been changed to protect their identity. Detectives informed the teenagers they were involved in a capital crime, the fatal shooting of a police officer. They were separated and questioned individually. One of the teens admitted to lying to police about the identity of the young man who had fled the scene of the crime.
Is the police officer that got shot tonight? All right. Who was in the car with you earlier?
His name was not Jose, as they had claimed hours earlier. The man police were looking for was Michael Anthony Lopez. He had run off, his friend said, because he believed there was a warrant out for his arrest,
You understand you're not under arrest?
and he did not want to go back to jail. Investigators ran a check on Michael Anthony Lopez and discovered he was a 17-year-old with a lengthy police record. At the time of the deputy's murder, Lopez was in violation of his parole. The district attorney's office issued an arrest warrant on the charge of capital murder. With the identity of the suspect established, the search was intensified. Police combed the area looking for any other clues that would tie Lopez to the murder, and they still had not found the murder weapon. With an armed cop killer on the loose, investigators knew they had to find their suspect quickly. Anyone coming into contact with the killer before authorities could find him was in danger. It was late summer of 1998 in Houston, Texas, and a young police officer had been gunned down after making a routine traffic stop. Evidence technicians painstakingly combed the crime scene to find any clues left behind by the killer. The suspect in the killing, 17-year-old Michael Lopez, was still on the loose. He was armed and considered extremely dangerous. Police searched through the night in the surrounding neighborhoods. On the morning of September 29th, 6 hours after the shooting of Deputy Constable Michael Eakin, Houston Police, Sheriff's Department, and Constable's Office personnel were briefed on the shooting and given a description of the suspect. They joined in the manhunt.
And the note of caution. Now, we're stressing you.
Investigators also began checking with the suspect's friends and family. According to juvenile records, his father was in jail and his mother's whereabouts were unknown. Lopez had been living with his grandparents about 3 miles from the scene of the shooting. Early that morning, Harris County deputies were dispatched to the home of Maria and Carlos Lopez. The elderly couple told police they had not seen their grandson for over a week. Investigators also learned that Lopez spent much of his time at the home of Elena Vasquez, his girlfriend. Elena and her sister Rosa told detectives that they had not heard from Lopez in weeks. Mark Schmidt, a sheriff's detective assigned to the case, had his doubts.
Of course, one of the things you're going to wonder about is, are they being on the up and up? Are they being honest with you?
Elena and her sister gave the detectives a few photographs of Lopez. Schmidt noted that in one of the photos, Lopez was wearing the small yet distinctive medallion and chain that was found inches from Deputy Eakin's body. By the following afternoon, a mobile command center was established near the crime scene. This became a base of operations for the collection of evidence, the processing of tips, and the search for the fugitive. Scores of officers from multiple agencies were mobilized to participate in the investigation.
In Harris County, we've got several constable precincts who have patrol units. Many of those constables' offices responded to assist.
The Sheriff's Department patrol, canine from the Sheriff's Department, a helicopter from the Sheriff's Department, State Highway Patrol, the Houston Police Department.
Investigators focused their search within a 2-mile perimeter of the crime scene. Details of the manhunt were sent to local news media, which broadcast a description of the fugitive.
21, the command post.
A police hotline was set up,
3121,
and members of the community were urged to report anything suspicious. Deputies were in a race against time. An armed killer was on the loose, and as word spread, the community became more and more alarmed. The suspect would have little difficulty hiding out in the stakeout zone. The area was filled with block after block of low-income housing, warehouses, and abandoned buildings. As news of the shooting continued to spread, leads began to accumulate. Each one was checked out. But as the day wore on, Lopez continued to elude authorities. The Harris County medical examiner gathered more information from the body of the victim, Michael Eakin. He had been shot twice, once in the head and once in the throat. The autopsy revealed that either of the bullet wounds would have been fatal. One bullet had entered his brain, instantly incapacitating him. The other bullet had severed the victim's spinal cord. Both bullets were recovered from Eakin's body by the medical examiner. The hunt for Eakin's suspected killer, Michael Lopez, intensified when a trail of blood was discovered near an intermediate school not far from the scene of the crime. Then another trail of blood was found on a nearby fence, and another on a driveway a few blocks away. Students were kept inside the school as canine units descended upon the location in an effort to track the killer by scent. Technicians recovered the blood samples for DNA analysis in the hope of matching them to the suspect once he was apprehended. A positive match would place the suspect at the crime scene. Canine units discovered another trail of blood on a nearby avenue. It continued behind a row of houses and a few blocks further along a gravel drive. But there, the trail ended. More than 12 hours after the murder of Deputy Michael Eakin, authorities were still no closer to finding his suspected killer.
The area that we were covering was probably about 2 square miles. You've got a lot of residences, schools. You got to wonder, did this person possibly slip into someone's home? Are they hiding in the home?
7124.
Later in the day, officers in the command post received an important lead. A resident within the stakeout zone called the hotline to report that she had discovered bloody clothing outside her home. Officers were immediately dispatched to the scene.
I'm so glad you're here. I called as soon as I found this stuff. I heard about it in the news.
Hidden near the foundation, detectives recovered a shirt caked with dried blood. Nearby was a hose and a puddle of water. It looked as if someone had tried to wash the blood off the shirt, but had given up and left it behind. The shirt matched the description of the one worn by the suspect, but it brought them no closer to finding Lopez.
So we were doing everything we could and going around individually checking residences for signs of being broke into, knocking on doors, is everything okay? Are y'all all right? And have you had any strangers try to talk their way into your home today?
With scores of law enforcement personnel on the hunt for Michael Lopez, authorities hoped they were closing in on him. But they couldn't be sure.
We did everything we could to contain the area, but you still worry, is there some way that he might have slipped through this and could be gone?
At 2 p.m., more than 12 hours after the shooting, police received another lead to the suspect's possible whereabouts.
Hey, how you doing? Yeah, we picked up a hitchhiker. We heard on
Two men who had seen a news story about the manhunt came to the command post, reporting that they had given a lift to a young man who fit the description of the suspect. They said they had dropped him off several miles from the crime scene. Now investigators were concerned that somehow Lopez had eluded them. If he had succeeded in getting another ride, he could be well out of the area. By nightfall, law enforcement officials had been split up into small groups and were combing the stakeout zone block by block, in search of more blood trails, a weapon, or anything that would bring them closer to finding the suspect. The command center continued to field calls from the public, yet Lopez was still out there somewhere, and police seemed no closer to catching him. To the frustrated investigators, it was beginning to look like a suspected cop killer might have escaped. In a low-income neighborhood on the outskirts of Houston, investigators from a half-dozen law enforcement agencies conducted a massive investigation and manhunt for a suspect in the fatal shooting of a young police officer. It had been 24 hours since the investigation into the murder of Deputy Michael Eakin had begun. And while forensic investigators had collected blood samples and other evidence at the crime scene, there had been no significant leads to the whereabouts of the killer. Investigators widened their search for Michael Lopez. They still had not found the murder weapon, so they had to assume the suspect was still armed and prepared to kill again. Finally, there was a break in the case.
Yes, sir. A citizen called in, saw suspicious.
In the early morning of September 30th, police received 3 separate 911 calls from residents in the stakeout zone.
If it goes across the street.
The callers reported having seen a bare-chested man moving around the backyard of an abandoned house located about a mile from the last known blood trail.
Next to the school here.
Police and canine units were immediately dispatched to the address. The canine picked up a scent. Converging on a small wooden garage on the property, investigators approached cautiously. If this was the man they were looking for, they knew he wasn't afraid to kill a cop. Weapons drawn, officers moved inside. The dog charged forward as a bloody young man emerged from behind a refrigerator and surrendered. The man was escorted out of the building, his hand bleeding from an apparent gunshot wound. His face, arms, and chest were covered with scratches and dried blood. The young man was unarmed and had no identification, but he matched the description of the fugitive. When asked, he confirmed that his name was Michael Anthony Lopez. Suspected of having killed Deputy Michael Eakin, he was taken into custody. Lopez was brought to a clinic where doctors treated his wounds, after which he was booked. Police gave him something to eat and a soda. He had been on the run for more than 24 hours.
Turn your head this way.
A suspected cop killer had finally been apprehended. The mobile command unit at the crime scene could be dismantled, and a frightened community could relax. For the prosecution, however, the hard work was just beginning. The exhausted fugitive was interrogated by detectives.
No,
He
sir.
seemed
No.
cooperative, answering all their questions.
Land there, that's right.
We got Mr. Rosenthal from the DA's.
When Assistant District Attorney Rosenthal arrived at the police station that morning, he was told that the suspect had given not one, but 2 written confessions. In both, he claimed that after being caught by Deputy Eakin, the two had scuffled and he had accidentally shot the officer. Rosenthal's first concern was that the suspect's rights had not been violated. With an eye toward an upcoming murder trial, he wanted to make sure the confessions would stand up in court.
One of the things I did when I first got there was I went up and talked to him myself. When Lopez was arrested, he was very dirty. He had a number of kind of small cuts and abrasions on him as if he'd been running through some briars. I asked him if he'd been treated fairly, and he was very matter of fact about the whole situation there. I mean, you would think that a young person who had been arrested for a capital crime, knowing he'd been arrested for a capital crime, would be intimidated by the situation or would be contrite, and I saw none of that in Michael Lopez.
Rosenthal was also perplexed by the suspect's gunshot wound. An examination of Deputy Eakin's gun, which was in his holster when his body was discovered, proved it had not been fired. Somehow, in the scuffle with Eakin, Lopez had shot himself with his own gun.
Who wouldn't be scared of a situation like that?
Lopez was unclear on that point. There were also several inconsistencies in the suspect's 2 statements concerning the shooting of the officer. To gain a conviction, Rosenthal knew he would have to be able to explain to the jury step by step exactly what happened when the 2 men ran off into the darkness that fatal night.
No denying. He shot Aiken. It's okay.
When a detective informed Rosenthal that Lopez had agreed to do a video walkthrough in which police would tape a 3rd confession at the crime scene, Rosenthal seized the opportunity. That afternoon, the suspect was taken under heavy guard to the parking lot and field alongside the Hardy Toll Road. Lopez waived his right to have an attorney present.
So I want you to tell me step by step what happened.
As a deputy recorded the suspect's statement with a video camera, Lopez told investigators his version of what happened the night of the shooting. From the beginning, Lopez maintained it was an accident.
Yeah. All right, well, show me then where you run to. Right?
Lopez claimed that he had been getting high sniffing paint thinner that night. He'd been hallucinating when the car in which he was riding was pulled over for speeding. He had an outstanding warrant, he claimed, and felt sure that Deputy Constable Eakin was going to arrest him. So he ran into a field alongside the highway with the deputy in pursuit. When the young officer caught him, Lopez said he told Eakin that he'd rather die than go back to jail.
He was basically trying to justify his actions. He was sticking with his story that he had a pistol that he told Michael Aiken that he had a pistol and that he was going to kill himself if Aiken persisted in arresting him.
He told investigators he held a gun to his own head, and when Eakin tried to take the gun, they struggled. The gun went off, and Eakin went down. To assist in the case, Rosenthal called on one of Houston's best and most persuasive prosecutors, Assistant District Attorney Kelly Siegler. She began to research the case history of the defendant, Michael Lopez.
It was unbelievable that someone who was only 17, and he had just turned 17, had been in that much trouble with the law before and had gotten such light punishment so many times.
1 week after Deputy Constable Michael Eakin was buried, Michael Anthony Lopez was arraigned and charged with capital murder. Both Siegler and Rosenthal knew that they had a good case, but it wasn't airtight. There were no witnesses to the crime. There was no clear motive. and the murder weapon had never been recovered. The strength of the prosecutor's case was in the forensic evidence that had been gathered. Technicians found that Lopez had left fingerprints on the car in which he was riding before the murder took place.
Yeah, these right here are looking real good.
DNA evidence also placed him at the scene. Samples were gathered from the medallion found at the crime scene and the clothes the suspect left behind as he fled. The evidence was put through 3 levels of testing. First, tests were performed to determine the presence of biological fluid, such as blood. Then confirmatory tests were conducted to double-check the results. Finally, a comparison DNA analysis was completed. Harris County DNA analyst Robin Freeman conducted the lab work.
The DNA analysis in this case was used to confirm that the blood that was found at the crime scene was consistent with the blood of the suspect, Michael Lopez.
The prosecution believed the forensic evidence offered irrefutable proof that Lopez had indeed been in the field where the deputy's body was found. Ballistics tests also confirmed that the 2 bullets that killed Deputy Eakin were fired by the same gun, most likely a .38 caliber Rossi revolver. But the gun still had not been recovered. According to his friends, Lopez had been seen with a .38 caliber Rossi in the past. Lopez said he lost his gun when he hid out overnight in a dumpster located about a mile from the shooting. But when detectives and a forensic team went back to retrieve it, they discovered more bloodstains, but no gun. The dumpster had been emptied. The weapon would be impossible to find.
I walked right back to here.
Without a weapon or an eyewitness to link Lopez to the crime, the prosecutors were left with a case made up mainly of circumstantial evidence. But they did have Lopez's confession, both in written form and on videotape. It was, in fact, the cornerstone to their case. The defense in coming weeks would take direct aim at this key piece of evidence. If the defense could convince a judge to rule the confessions inadmissible, the door would be open for an acquittal. Michael Anthony Lopez was charged with the shooting death of Deputy Constable Michael Eakin in September 1998. By the spring of 1999, prosecutors Chuck Rosenthal and Kelly Siegler were still hard at work sifting through evidence, planning courtroom strategy, and fighting off a wave of defense motions that, if successful, would have crippled their case. The defense alleged that Lopez had been beaten and coerced into making his confessions. They asked for a change in venue.
And to the jury,
they even requested the removal of prosecutor Chuck Rosenthal, claiming his conversations with the defendant might make it necessary for him to be called as a witness.
They didn't have legal grounds to do that because there are other witnesses who could testify to the same things I could.
In a victory for the prosecution, the judge denied all such defense motions. The prosecutors could now focus on how they would present their case to a jury. On May 17, 1999, the case of the state of Texas versus Michael Anthony Lopez came to trial. In her opening statement, Assistant District Attorney Kelly Siegler declared that the prosecution had a strong case. There were eyewitnesses who saw Deputy Constable Eakin chase Lopez into the field. DNA evidence connecting Lopez to the crime scene. And perhaps most damning of all, there was the videotaped confession in which Lopez admitted to killing Michael Eakin. Siegler and fellow prosecutor Chuck Rosenthal were confident they had enough evidence for a conviction. The defense opted not to make an opening statement, choosing instead to refute the prosecution's case piece by piece over the course of the trial. It's a strategy that can put even a seasoned prosecutor on edge. Without an opening statement from the defense, the prosecution can't even get a glimpse of what the defense strategy will be.
Come with me.
On the first day of the trial, 3 of the occupants of the Cadillac were called to the witness stand. Their descriptions of the night of the murder were consistent. The 6 teenagers had no specific plans that evening. They were, they testified, just hanging out.
There were no plans at all. Were there any kind of drugs in the back seat of the car?
Yes, sir.
What was that?
The witnesses admitted that on the night of the shooting, they had been huffing, a cheap method of getting high by inhaling paint thinner fumes. When the Cadillac was pulled over, Lopez became anxious. He was wanted on a probation violation, he told his friends. He then asked Ortiz to stop the car in a spot that would make it easier for him to run if he needed to. Deputy Eakin was polite and professional, the teenagers said.
Aracela Gonzalez.
He asked them for their identification. When Lopez produced none, the deputy told him to get out of the car. He was going to frisk the young man, but at the first opportunity, Lopez bolted, and the deputy gave chase into the darkness. Moments later, through the muggy stillness, came gunshots.
Was the only one asked to...
Through the testimony of the other teenagers in the car with Lopez on the night of the shooting, the prosecution established that the defendant was high, he was agitated, and he was the only one who ran off into the field that night.
Do you know the names of the other deputies that actually went
Prosecutors
inside
then introduced a parade of deputies who described the discovery of Deputy Eakin's body, the manhunt for Lopez, and the careful collection of forensic evidence. Deputy Sean Conrad proved to be one of the strongest witnesses for the prosecution.
On the night of Deputy Eakin's murder, who was the first to find his...
Conrad, like many officers, had been called to the scene after Deputy Michael Eakin had stopped responding to radio calls.
Arrived to the scene of the crime, several deputies.
He hoped to find Eakin somewhere in the field, he said, hunting for his radio on the ground.
I was the first.
And how did you find his body?
But then he spotted the mortally wounded deputy.
Well, he was lying on his back, and he had what appeared to be a gunshot wound to his throat. And I was hoping he was still alive, but I knew he wasn't.
Thank you very much, officer.
With Deputy Conrad still on the stand, the defense took the opportunity to start whittling away at the credibility of the state's witnesses. Defense attorney Ricardo Rodriguez argued that his client, Michael Lopez, had been beaten by police at the time of his arrest and later coerced into giving his confessions. It was a plausible assertion. The defendant was accused of killing their fellow law enforcement officer, and he had multiple cuts and bruises on his face when he was booked. Deputy Conrad was asked to testify about the night Lopez was apprehended.
And isn't it true, sir, that there were some people out there who were a little hot-headed?
What do you mean by hot-headed?
Deputy Conrad disagreed with the defense's claim that the arresting officers were bent on beating up Lopez. But defense attorney Ricardo Rodriguez pointed out that Conrad was not actually present at the moment Michael Lopez was found in the abandoned garage. So Conrad couldn't have known whether or not the defendant had been beaten when he was arrested.
Officer, you personally didn't go inside that garage to effect the arrest of this defendant, did you, sir?
No, sir. He was already being brought out by the time I made it up to the garage.
Other deputies on the stand vigorously denied any wrongdoing. though the defense questioned why none of the officers who actually made the arrest had been called by the prosecution to testify.
Officer, isn't there a code of silence in the precinct not to talk about somebody getting beat up?
I've never been involved in anything that would be a beating.
But isn't it common knowledge, sir, that if one deputy sees another deputy beating a defendant, that deputy isn't going to say anything, is he?
Objection.
That's sustained.
Is there or is there not a code of silence among police officers?
I can't answer for other police officers. I can only answer for myself.
You've heard of it, have you not, sir?
I've heard what some people have said about it. Yes, sir.
The defense probing forced one deputy to admit he'd noticed a fresh cut on the forehead of Lopez when he was taken into custody. And photos of the defendant taken in jail showed what looked like fresh bruises on his back and limbs. With each cross-examination, the defense looked stronger. But with only 1 day of testimony left, prosecutors Chuck Rosenthal and Kelly Siegler knew the most persuasive witness had yet to be heard. Michael Anthony Lopez was on trial for the murder of Deputy Constable Michael Eakin. For 2 straight days, Lopez had been forced to listen to friends, police officers, and forensic experts all testify against him. Now, in an odd twist, the young defendant would hear perhaps the most damning witness of all speak against him. That witness was himself. Prosecutors played the videotaped confession that Lopez gave soon after his capture.
And then he pats you down.
Brought back to the grassy field where the murder took place, Lopez had detailed the whole crime, explaining why he ran and why he fired the fatal shots.
And then I run.
And you run where? Do you run this way? Do you run this way?
No, I ran that way.
He was still high, he said, when Eakin made him get out of the car. He'd started thinking about his life and how he didn't want to go to jail, to be away from his girlfriend, his family. He felt his only option was to run. In the struggle with Deputy Eakin, Lopez claimed, he pulled out his gun and held it to his own head, threatening to kill himself rather than go to jail. The deputy was behind him when he raised the gun up over his shoulder, pointing it blindly.
Okay. The gun goes off?
Yeah.
Then, Lopez claimed, his mind went blank. The confession was powerful, but it also offered a plausible argument for the defense. For Lopez consistently stated on the tape that the shooting had been an accident. To be convicted of capital murder, prosecutors would have to prove that Lopez killed the deputy intentionally or knowingly. There was no way prosecutors could get inside the defendant's mind. But they had one final piece of evidence they felt certain would convince the jury of the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Deputy Eakin's body, as it was discovered in the grassy field that night, offered vital clues to crime scene investigators like John Dickinson. He took the stand to refute the defendant's version of events.
Well, according to Lopez, both he and the officer had their guns out and they were struggling, and Lopez's gun went off first. But if that were the case, Eakin would have been found on the ground with the gun in his hand or the gun on the ground.
Eakin's body was discovered gripping a pair of open handcuffs, and his gun was still in its holster. According to Dickinson, if the defendant had truly been flailing a gun about as he claimed, there was no way Eakin would have holstered his weapon and tried to handcuff an armed suspect. Post-mortem examinations of the body and testimony from the coroner also confirmed that the shots were fired at very close range. And the angle of bullet entry wounds indicated that at least one shot, the shot that severed Eakin's spinal cord, was likely fired when the deputy was lying on the ground.
We've heard about a video confession.
The trial lasted 4 days. Both sides gave impassioned closing statements. Defense attorney Ricardo Rodriguez insisted the confession was coerced, claiming the defendant had been in no condition to make a coherent decision, having been beaten and having gone without sleep for more than 40 hours.
No matter what you do.
If the jury agreed, they would have no choice but to throw out the confession and base their verdict on the remaining circumstantial evidence. Prosecutor Kelly Siegler spoke with equal determination. It was easy to feel sorry for him, she said. Sitting there in a suit, the defendant seemed young, meek. But there was a violence and rage and impulsiveness that burned inside his soul, she added.
And he's going to do anything he can.
Then, an outburst by the defendant disrupted the courtroom.
Listen, no, that's not right.
Finally, Kelly Siegler thought, the jury caught a glimpse of the real Michael Lopez.
Listen to me.
And you know, the point was for the jury to see that temper he just can't control. Nobody can control it. Even in a courtroom when he's on trial for his very life with Ted Poe on the bench and police officers all over the place, he still can't control his temper.
After deliberating for a mere 2.5 hours, the jury sent a note to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The jury declared Michael Anthony Lopez guilty of the murder of Deputy Constable Michael Eakin. Despite his impassioned pleas, Lopez would have to pay for his crime. But how? Life imprisonment or execution? The death penalty required a unanimous decision. All 12 jurors would have to be in agreement.
If any one person on the jury believes that there's any one reason or factor that makes them go, you know what, just because of that, just because I feel like it in my heart, I want to give him a life sentence, the law allows them to do it. It gives them an out.
Prosecutors had to convince the jury of 2 points: that Michael Lopez posed a future threat to society, and that there were no circumstances in his life that would warrant a life sentence instead of execution. The prosecution team presented a series of witnesses who had observed a gradual escalation of violent behavior. Others had been victimized. His girlfriend's sister testified that he had threatened her with a gun. She claimed that he'd told her of his wish to kill a police officer. The defense had a different strategy. In lieu of many voices, they chose one, a persuasive and sympathetic witness. That witness was Michael Anthony Lopez Sr., the defendant's father.
And how long have you been in jail?
Admittedly a terrible role model, the elder Lopez had been in jail more often than out of it. He expressed humility and regret at having failed to support his son in any way.
Didn't lead him at all.
And he begged the jury to be merciful. While the jury deliberated, Siegler's thoughts kept returning to the victim. Like Lopez, Deputy Michael Eakin also came from a broken home, growing up in the tough, lower-income neighborhoods of Houston, Texas.
I guess it's just there was something in Michael Eakin inside him that made him turn out to be good and different and want to be a cop.
After nearly 6 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with its verdict in the sentencing phase of the trial. Again, it was unanimous. He received the death penalty. State District Judge Ted Poe spoke directly to the defendant before adjourning.
I wanted to make sure he knew what he had done, that he was personally accountable for his actions. It wasn't society's fault. It wasn't his neighborhood's fault. He chose to murder a police officer.
Michael Lopez is currently on death row in Texas, awaiting the same fate to which he sentenced his victim. Michael Eakin is still fondly remembered by family, friends, and the prosecutors who worked to bring his killer to justice.